All right. Welcome everyone to our next webinar. We will be starting in just a few minutes. The runtime for this webinar is around half an hour. And I will leave you in the capable hands of my colleague Janice, who will be taking care of you for the rest of the evening. Over to you, Janice.
Thank you, Fabio. Hi, everyone. Welcome, everyone. I think, judging by the name, we have lots of participants from out of Europe as well. I think we have some participants from Asia. So welcome for joining us. Good evening and very good afternoon to our friends in Europe and other parts of the world. So today, the topic of today's webinar is open innovation, what it is and how do we make it work. And we have Dr. Nessa Carey joining us today. Just quickly to give a bit of bio background of Dr. Nessa Carey. I'm sure you all have seen her bio in our registration page. So Nessa Carey has a biology PhD from the University of Edinburgh and is a former senior lecturer in molecular biology at Imperial College London. So she works in the biotech and pharmaceutical industry for over 13 years. And now she splits her professional time between providing consultancy services to some of the UK's leading research institutions and training people around the world in how to create benefits for society from basic research. And she's also a visiting professor at Imperial College. Welcome. Thank you, Nessa, for joining us today.
Hi, it's great to be here, Janice, even though we are recording, which means my disastrous lockdown haircut is going to be preserved for all of mankind, which is a terrible thing, but there you go.
All for the good memories, Nessa, here. Yeah. So, well, without further ado, let's go to the first question here. So we are here today to talk about open innovation. So perhaps let's start the webinar by asking Nessa here, what is open innovation? How do you define and how do people define this?
Open innovation, I think, is one of those topics where the definitions now become so broad, it's almost meaningless. It's almost easier to talk about what isn't open innovation. But open innovation simply means that an organization gets its ideas not just from within the organization, but from outside the organization. And that can be from doing research collaborations, it could be getting them from patents, it could be getting them from customer engagement or looking at what your competitors are doing. There's a whole range of ways that you can do it. And I would argue, really these days, we should almost just talk about innovation. Open innovation has almost become a meaningless term because there are very few organizations involved in innovation that don't get ideas from the outside world. You'd have to be basically operating in a cave. But it essentially means that innovation is happening across different organizations, different sectors. And one thing that we forget is we almost always think of open innovation as companies getting ideas from outside. But we also have to think there's the flip side, that it's also about organizations sending ideas outside and sending their innovation outside. So it's basically just about this flow of innovation, and it's such a buzzword, but actually it's something almost all of us have been doing for decades.
Thank you, Nessa. I forgot to mention that everyone, you are welcome to post your questions or comments on the chat box. So you can send it to the panelists or to everyone. So if you have any question during the session, please we welcome your question here. And thank you for the definition, Nessa. It sounds like it's very interesting here. And I think we would like to know our attendees here. We have about 22 people joining us today right now, and I can see the number is increasing. We'd like to know, do you out there, people, do you engage in open innovation, after hearing Nessa's definition? So here, we would like to launch a poll. So give me a second while I launch the poll here. So if you're logging in and joining us from a laptop and hopefully on a mobile, smart mobile, you'll be able to do this. So here I have a poll. So do you or your organization involved in open innovation relationship with companies or organizations? If yes, Are they local or international companies? So I'll just pause here for a couple of seconds for everyone to put in their results. So you can select no if you're not, or you do open innovation with local companies, with international companies, or with both. Thank you. I can see we have 15 responses now, and I can see the numbers are increasing. We'll give a couple more seconds. Maybe 5 more seconds here for those who would like to put in their answers. Thank you. All right, I see the numbers have stopped now. I'm going to end the polling now, and just let me share the results here. I hope everyone can see my results. So we have about 26% who actually we have about 18 people responded. So sorry, 19 people responded. So out of 26% of 19 people say they are not engaged in open innovation. And about 3 or 16% says they're currently engaging open innovation with local companies. So depending where you are based or from. And also about 11 participants, 58%, more than 50% people actually engage in both local and international companies. Thank you. So let me just stop sharing the result now. And so based on the poll here, we know that many of the people, more than half the participants actually engage in open innovation. And as part of dealing with open innovation, you know, the topic of or issues of IP comes into the conversation. So Nessa, what does it mean for IP for companies or organizations that actually engage in open innovation?
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot when I'm running training courses, is if you're doing open innovation, what's the IP strategy? And of course, it's a question you can't answer in those terms, because open innovation can take so many different forms. It can range from, even if you think about, say, a university and a company working together, it can range from the university doing pure contract research for a company, in which case you would expect the company basically to own all the IP, to a collaboration in which both parties are bringing IP to the table and generating IP, but in which the terms are such that you would expect the university to own the IP. You can have that entire range. So what you have to do is think about what you're trying to achieve by the open innovation and the business strategy that you're going for, and what those business needs are. So there's no one IP strategy that fits open innovation. Some of the most interesting examples of open innovation, though, have been ones where you've had really big universities and really big companies working together, and they've decided to file no IP whatsoever. So you can go absolutely from nobody bothers filing IP or protecting IP, all the way through to it's defined right at the outset that one organization will own all the intellectual property. So just calling something open innovation doesn't mean that you automatically can say, right, now I know which IP type to go for. Doesn't work like that. You have to think about why you're doing it in business terms. So there's no one strategy.
Thank you, Nessa. It sounds like that's like both extreme. You have people who are very happy with, you know, doing open innovation, and like you mentioned, open innovation doesn't mean that, you know, there's no IP strategy behind it. And there's a question actually from Jia Feng, and he did mention that he finds IP is an issue, but his key question here is what are the KPIs for open innovation or innovation in general? There's a question on key challenges, which we will come to that later on. Yeah. But Nessa, before you answer that question, perhaps linking to the definition, because I think James Crocker here has a question on a request to restate the definition for open innovation.
Okay, so open innovation simply means that innovation, ideas, resources are accessed via not just your own organization. So that's really what open innovation is, that you get your innovative ideas from outside your organization. And our tendency is to think, well, that must mean that there's, excuse me, for example, a long-running collaboration with the university. Sorry, it's not coronavirus, I have hay fever. But it can be much simpler than that. Open innovation may simply mean you read a published patent and it gave you an idea. Open innovation can come into an organization through its customers. So one of my favorite examples of this is Lego. So Lego engages with user groups who come up with ideas for new Lego sets. It is a source of lifelong regret to me, for example, that I never managed to get the Big Bang Theory Lego set. So there are all sorts of different ways that it can happen. It can simply be customers coming up with great ideas, all the way through to an extraordinary collaboration between a leading university and a leading company. But it's basically about ideas coming into an organization from outside, but also the organization pushing ideas outside as well. So that's what open innovation is. It means you're not just sitting in your company box. In terms of IP though, can you remind me what the question was?
Yes.
As always, I've just rambled on.
Yes, I think this follows on, what are the typical KPIs for open innovation?
Yeah. So again, I would love to be able to say, oh, here's a tick box, and under the open innovation tick box, here is the KPIs. But it simply doesn't work like that. It requires an understanding of what all the parties involved are trying to achieve and why, and trying to make sure those are aligned, and then deciding what the KPIs are. Because for some innovation, for some open innovation, the KPI might be that the main company ends up with a 15% bigger market share. But for another open innovation situation, the KPI might be that the organization has, or the collaboration has published a certain number of papers and distributed resources freely to academics on every continent that has a research base. So it absolutely depends on what you're trying to achieve. But it's very important to have an idea of that, well, actually to have a very firm idea of that before you get involved. It's really important to make sure that at the beginning, you all have the same idea of what you're trying to achieve. Because if you're not clear on that at the beginning, then as the collaboration proceeds, it will be nightmarish. Never get into open innovation just as a convenient way of getting your name on a grant or raising your credibility. If you're not aligned with your partners in the open innovation, it will become very eggy very quickly. And those are a nightmare to manage. I've had to manage ones like that, and it's just been horrible, really horrible.
Thank you, Nessa. Sounds like there's lots of, in addition to your IP strategy, you need to align with, a lot of your other strategy, your internal strategy, and your external companies whom you're going to collaborate. You need to align with their strategy as well. Yeah. So you also touched on, open innovation requires lots of resources, people, time, energy, and money. And you mentioned about aligning strategy. So in your experience or your view, how can one company align its open innovation strategy with their available resources?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one. There are often very good cost reasons for doing open innovation and for doing collaborative research. But you shouldn't assume that it will be necessarily cheaper. Sometimes for a company, there's a real cost advantage to working with other companies, for example, but other times that isn't the case. And certainly the open innovation that I've been involved in, particularly when I was in biotech, the ones that were most difficult to pull off successfully were ones where I would be told by my boss things like, well, this won't need much resource. We don't need to put much money into it. Yeah, we can make in-kind contributions. And yes, it didn't need much actual cash, but what it did was consume an enormous amount of staff time. And the amount of staff time that it consumed was inversely proportional to how aligned the objectives were of the different parties. So if everyone wanted different things out of it, then it required an enormous amount of my time just to keep the project moving forward. So there is always a cost. And you have to be very clear why you're entering into this. The cost may not be financial, but it may be that it's a cost in staff time. So it's not that you actually hand over cash, but you're using up a lot of staff time. And of course, when you're doing that, your staff are not doing other things. So there's always an opportunity cost in there. You have to be very clear why you're doing it. There can also be emotional costs. If for example, your staff think that you're doing the open innovation because you think people outside the organization have better ideas than they have, there's actually enormous emotional security that you have to generate. You have to get everybody within your organization on side on why you're doing this as well, because otherwise they can see it as a judgment upon them. So it's not the simple, you know, let's just do everything outside and it'll all be easy. It's not some sort of golden solution. It requires a huge amount of work. And actually a lot of the work goes on before the relationship is set up. And a lot of the work that's required is about maintaining human relationships. I always maintain that anything that involves technology transfer is not really about the tech, it's really about the people. And you have to make sure you build those people-to-people relationships. And if you're involved in open innovation with a really big company, that's really difficult because big companies restructure all the time. And you may have a fantastic relationship with the person you first start working with, and then they get moved on to another project or another department. And the whole thing, you have to start the human relationships from scratch again. So you need to take into account these human factors.
Thank you, Nessa. I think we have lots of questions coming in, but before we answer those questions, one of the topics that we would like to touch on this conversation today is challenges, which one of the questions also mentioned earlier on. Before we go to that, here's another poll to let's check with our audience here. You know, what do you think are the challenges for open innovation, or maybe there are challenges that currently you are facing? So I'm going to launch the poll now and allow for about 10 seconds for people to respond. So the question here is, do you find you or your organization find it challenging to engage in open innovation relationship? If yes, what is the one key challenge? So I think this allows multiple response as well. Do you find it challenging? If yes, what are the challenges? Is it technical, language, or cultural barrier? And I think Nessa, earlier on, you mentioned about maintaining relationships. So I suppose managing relationship, it's also a challenge, that internal relationship and external relationship with your collaborative companies.
Yeah, absolutely. Unless it's a very simple contractual, we pay you and you do this. I think that those relationships are absolutely key to making something successful. And you also have to make sure that the people, whether you're in a university or you're in a company or whatever organization you're in, you have to make sure that the people who really have power in your organization are also engaged in this process, and that they're supportive, because if they're not, you're going to get nowhere. It will be such a struggle all the time. So always make sure there are champions, and champions who have power. That's really important.
Thank you, Nessa. Well, I'm going to close the poll now. So we have about 50% people responded to this polling, and I'm going to share the result now. So there's about 40%, so 6 out of 15 who responded say that they don't find it challenging yet. And those who responded it is challenging while dealing with open innovation relationships. So technical challenge, it's about 33% mentioned that. And language and cultural barrier is actually an influence or a challenge as well.
Yeah, I think those figures they're very much as one would expect. The technical challenges are also often cultural challenges, but they're cultural challenges between organizational types. One of the worst open innovation things I ever did was simply, I was setting up basically a relationship between an academic lab and a very large company. And I should have known better. I took for granted that both parties meant the same thing when they used the same words. So the academic told me that the assay was robust and reliable and easy to run. And the company told me that was what they were looking for, but they meant completely different things by the phrases robust and reliable and easy to run. So the academic meant that a postdoc could do it once a week and it usually worked. A company meant they wanted to be able to put it into 4-well plates and have somebody who had been trained for an afternoon be able to run it forever. It was an absolute nightmare, and it was my own fault. I should have checked that we all meant the same thing by the same language. So always probe, especially if there's a quantitative outcome you could get to. Ask people what they mean by the phrase robust or reproducible or whatever, because that was really embarrassing, and it was entirely my own fault. I should have known better.
Yes, I think perhaps, you know, not only conversation, I think this is expectation as well, different culture, like you said, you know, they may, you know, define robust or being run efficiently differently. And also during open innovation, for both parties to come into open innovation agreement, there's lots of conversation and discussion, and agreements need to be done beforehand as well. And, you know, lots of resources and time are being spent, you know, in argument, like you mentioned. Potentially there might be argument in the examples that you mentioned.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I think has been a really good development in the UK, and there's always loads of interest when I talk about it elsewhere, is in the development of the Lambert Toolkit, which is particularly helpful for working out what's going on in academic and industrial collaborations, which of course are one of the major ways in which those two sectors interact. And the Lambert Toolkit really helps to surface all of those problems right at the beginning, before you sign an agreement, and then helps guide you through what would be appropriate contractual responses and who would own the intellectual property. And for anyone who's not familiar with it, I would say go to the UK IPO website and check out the Lambert Toolkit, because you can save an enormous amount of time by using this. And I have to say, the UK IPO website is startlingly good for a UK government website. It's actually clear, it's accessible, and it's helpful. So some tools have been developed to try to formalize these approaches and take the pain out of them, because particularly otherwise, if you have inexperienced organizations, you're just having the same arguments and discussions that have been had hundreds of times in the past. It's such a waste of time. So yeah, I would check out those sorts of resources.
Thank you, Nessa. I think there are a couple of questions actually coming in. I'm asking for, you know, what are the, you know, documents or kind of tools that will, you know, guide them to prepare for open innovation, conversation and discussion and agreement as well. So
Lambert is really helpful for that. I would also say that what I would absolutely always urge is, if you're getting involved in open innovation, no matter what it is and across which sectors, sit down and have a discussion first about what you're all trying to achieve, rather than starting the discussion with, well, here's our standard contract and here's your standard contract. Obviously, you have to have lawyers involved at some point, but no disrespect to our legal friends, try and keep them out of the process until as late as possible. So make sure you've agreed what you're all trying to achieve and why, and that you're all aligned, and then get the contracts drawn up to reflect that, rather than using the contracts as negotiating tools in the first place.
Thank you, Nessa. It's good that you mentioned about alignment again, because we have a participant talking about, you know, commenting about the alignment topic that we mentioned earlier on, because Jia Feng do first mention that, you know, he do find it difficult to align, and in their own cases, he thinks that it's more to do with having complementary goals and acknowledgement each other's contribution. And, you know, I'm just aware of time here. We only have 30 minutes, but then we have lots of questions coming in, and even our own, we have topics to discuss about as well. So perhaps I was going to ask you, you know, about your time at Pfizer when it renewed its involvement in two of the UK's leading open innovation programs, the DSTT at University of Dundee and the Structured Genomics Consortium at University of Oxford. So both involve multiple pharmaceutical companies. So I trust there's a lot of alignment needed to be going on during, you know, in this program. So, you know, while commenting on the alignment, perhaps you can share with us as well, you know, why such big companies, you know, like to sometimes work together like this.
Yeah, everybody always thinks in a particular sector, the big companies would never work together, they'd always compete. And that's often true, but there are times when it is worth them working together. So the Structural Genomics Consortium is one of my favorites, and I was only involved in Pfizer's renewal. I wasn't involved in Pfizer's original involvement, and I wasn't involved in the original setting up of the SGC. And I just want to give huge kudos here to particularly Al Edwards and Chaz Bountra and Malcolm Skingle, who are basically University of Toronto, Oxford, GSK, who created this marvelous thing. And the Structural Genomics Consortium was basically a group of pharmaceutical companies and universities working together in a particularly unexplored area of biology and chemistry, epigenetics. And basically saying, we need to understand epigenetics more, and we need to create the reagents so that people can probe the activity of different epigenetic pathways, etc. And the best way of doing it would be all to work together and all to contribute. And one of the things that was really startling about the SGC was that they argued apparently at the beginning a lot about how do we protect the intellectual property. And then they all decided that actually the best thing to do was to protect none of it, that it was all pre-competitive. And therefore there was no actual commercial value in it. And it was much better that everybody contributed and everybody benefited. And it wasn't just members of the SGC consortium, they made the reagents available to everybody. And it hugely opened up a really exciting field. And what that meant, of course, was that all the companies could all share the cost of opening up this new exciting field and get the benefit of working with fantastic academic laboratories, so that the whole field would accelerate. Where, of course, it's incredibly difficult to use that model is once you start getting into the competitive space. Once you start getting into the commercial space, then that incentive for the companies to work together starts to disappear. It's not just the pharmaceutical industry that does this. The car industry does it as well. I was reading some really, really interesting papers about this. In the automobile industry, about 40% of the R&D that is done so that cars continue to meet regulatory requirements. As the environmental laws and the safety laws and all the other laws get stricter, all the companies have to invest. Sorry, that's my phone, and my partner's about to charge out of a room and grab that phone. Sorry about that. Because almost half of the R&D budget in the automobile industry involves stuff that you just have to do that doesn't give you a profitable edge over your competitors. It makes no sense for all the companies to pay separately to do their own R&D. It makes perfect sense for them to combine, because then they can all solve the same problems that they're all facing, which add value for none of them in a much cheaper way. So there's often that financial driver. DSTT at Dundee was very different. DSTT was set up to make use of the fantastic understanding of kinases and kinase drugs at the University of Dundee. And that was a really interesting hub and spoke model, because what happened was all the pharmaceutical companies worked with the University of Dundee, but they all kept their own intellectual property very, very secret from each other. And again, GSK was absolutely pivotal in setting this up. So there we have examples. In both cases, you had pharmaceutical companies working together, but with very different IP arrangements. And those IP arrangements reflected how close you were to the commercial space. So I think they're really, really good examples of how you can use incredibly open innovation in different ways to solve standard problems. Thank
you, Nessa. There's a question actually, asking, and perhaps this sort of like go back to the fundamentals or main question, like why would one want to engage in open innovation? We talk about the challenges and the risks and the costs, but with closed innovation, is it a way to go, or when would someone or a organization decide whether they want to engage in open or go back to a closed innovation?
It's very rarely as binary as that, and it's almost impossible to avoid open innovation, because other organizations, other individuals are coming up with great ideas all the time, and the only way to avoid open innovation is to shut yourself off from the world completely. Because in its broadest, possibly most meaningless sense, open innovation just means getting your ideas from the outside world. You can, however, see that there would be situations where closed innovation might be a much better idea. And there you might think, well, that would possibly be around companies whose entire product is based around trade secrets, for example. So if your entire commercial advantage is based around trade secrets, you certainly don't want to collaborate if there is any risk that by collaborating you reveal any of your IP. So you can imagine that a company like that might have a greater focus on closed innovation. And then and Apple is an interesting example. Depending on who you talk to, Apple is either the major driver in closed innovation of keeping everything very close to itself, because it reveals very little about what it does. It doesn't really share its innovation with the world. But on the other hand, the reason the Apple platform is so valuable is because it's provided a platform for apps. And then, of course, Apple benefits from the fees for those. It can benefit from data from those. So you could argue that Apple is actually a very open innovation organization as well. So it's again that thing of, you don't start with the question, do we want to do open or closed innovation? You start with the question of, what are we trying to achieve? And given where we are at the moment, what is the best way of achieving it? Would it be open or closed innovation? And you can see, if you look at the history of fields, companies like Rubbermaid, who used to have a huge tranche of the US domestic cleaning products market, that one of their problems was they didn't move to open innovation. They were convinced they knew everything, and that they knew everything, even what their customers wanted, and they lost enormous market share. So it's really a case of thinking, what do we want to do as an organization? That always has to be the first question.
Thank you, Nessa. I think I'm just looking at the time now, and it's come to an end. Yes, come to an end to our 30-minute webinar series. So sounds like, it's a very close, good ending there, Nessa. You gave out to the audience here today, on why would you engage in open innovation? The first key question is, what do you want to achieve there, and how can you achieve, by setting out, what you want to achieve there. So
Janice, before we close, can I make one plug for something? Can I recommend something to everybody?
Sure.
So
yes.
I noticed that Tom Hockaday is one of the participants here, and those of you who know Tom know that he was an absolute giant in the field of university and company interactions. So knows all about open innovation, and Tom has a new book out about university technology transfer. So I would suggest that a lot of you go and have a read of Tom's book, because it will give you loads more insight into how organizations can work together than we can possibly cover in a 30-minute webinar.
Sure, thank you, Nessa, and thank you, Tom, for joining us. Thank you. I think we have a few, I hope we've managed to cover, the questions that, people have been sending in, either through conversation or answers and examples that Nessa provided in this webinar today. Please do, thank you for your time. And that's it. That's the end of our webinar series. And I can see lots of people saying thanks are coming to the chat box. And thank you very much.
So thanks for everyone for dialing in. It's lovely to have a chance to talk with everyone.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Nessa. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.